All right, so quick update on the Mario Kart situation. In my last video, I talked about a patch that Nintendo released that, based on their notes, seemingly undid something that a lot of Mario Kart players really didn't like, specifically concerning Mario Kart World. So the distinction between 3-lap courses and intermission courses, or the highway courses, that's where the sort of the forefront of the controversy lies, where in online multiplayer, when you finish a 3-lap course, you are taken to this menu where you can vote for what the next track will be. And more often than not, it'll take you to essentially an intermission or highway track that is far less desired than the 3-lap courses, because the intermission tracks are just deemed to be inferior in their design, requiring less skill, less strategy. They're just more boring. There's just a level of gameplay that isn't quite as refined as the 3-lap courses. And so Nintendo forcing players to engage with the intermission courses is just something that people didn't like. And so they discovered that the random button, essentially, if that's what's voted for most, and if that's what's picked, it'll essentially guarantee a 3-lap course. But then Nintendo, being Nintendo and wanting to control the way you play, decided to update that feature out of the game in this patch 1.1.2, where they adjusted courses selected in random when selecting next course in a wireless versus race, so that it doesn't guarantee a 3-lap course, so that more often than not, it will take you to an intermission or highway track, because Nintendo wants players to play a mix of both. But players are straight up telling Nintendo, we don't like that. We don't like the intermission courses, and we'd like to have at least the option to forego those courses. Nintendo said, nah, bro, we decide what's best for you. We decide what's best for the game, and in the stubborn way that Nintendo can often be. But then they came out with this patch recently on July 29th, 2025, version 1.2.0, that seemingly addressed this, that seemingly indicated that they heard and listened to the backlash and the feedback and made some adjustments, because the backlash for this was pretty severe. I mean, from forums and social media to major Nintendo and Mario Kart content creators, universally, this was an abhorred update. And so right here we have a bullet point that reads, increase the frequency of lap-type courses appearing in the selection when choosing the next course in versus race and wireless races. A lot of folks on social media were happy about seeing that bullet point, and news outlets came out and talked about how Nintendo seems to have undone at least aspects of that change that people really didn't like. But what I said in my last video discussing this was, time will tell whether the update pushes that enough, whether it reverses the abhorred change enough that players are actually going to be happy with the situation, or if the change is too minimal, where even if some kind of adjustment was made, it's not enough to ultimately fix the issue of not giving players the choices that they want to make as far as what tracks they want to play online is concerned. And now we know that based on the experiences that Mario Kart World players have been having, Nintendo ultimately changed absolutely nothing. Hell, I mean, it's as good as lying, essentially, what Nintendo did, given how few differences there are. And among the biggest proponents of this situation is Shortcat, who is a Mario Kart dedicated YouTuber who came out with this video titled Thanks Nintendo. I highly recommend you give it a watch. It gives you a rundown of all of the patch updates and additions, and some of the additions are neat, others are really minor, and then there's some still baffling lack of quality of life updates to the game. But generally, among the focuses of this video is testing that Shortcat did, going online and doing a bunch of races to see if there is indeed a higher frequency of the 3-lap courses and tracks that people prefer. But what he discovered was that not only is that issue not fixed, it doesn't seem like much has changed at all. Like, he doesn't feel like any sort of shift has happened in the probability of 3-lap courses appearing more often. And while on the back end of the game, Nintendo could argue that they did make some adjustments, so they could have technically increased the frequency of lap-type courses appearing in the selection when choosing the next course in versus race and wireless races. While that technically can be true, we don't know exactly by how much. And one of the things that Shortcat highlighted is that Nintendo has a tendency to make their patch notes incredibly vague. They don't give you exact percentages and numerical values so you can really test the waters and really determine exactly what changes happened. They put out these vague statements like, just increase the frequency, but that could mean anything. Increase the frequency by 0.01%, and increase the frequency by 100% still fall under the category of this bullet point because of the lack of specificity. So they can get away with putting out bullet points like these that ultimately may be inconsequential, that technically may be true, but in the effects that players feel may not make any difference, and still get away with essentially what is a lie that involves technical truths that ultimately isn't reflected enough in the end result to justify this bullet point. And that is just incredibly egregious to be able to put out a statement like this. And Nintendo knew exactly what they were doing with this bullet point. They put out this bullet point because they knew that the backlash was intense, and they knew that people would look at this and run away with it. And on social media, we did see a lot of people just looking at this bullet point and immediately celebrating, which is why I said in my last video, time will tell whether the increase of frequency for lab type courses will be enough that this can be an issue we can bury in the ground, we can move on from, or whether it's something that will come up again. Lo and behold, not only did it come up again because the increase of frequency for lab type courses wasn't enough, there's such little difference in the end result that this bullet point might as well be a lie. And I've seen companies pull stuff like this before. So for example, when loot boxes was a major topic of controversy years back, it still continues to be, but back when companies were getting overzealous with their implementation of loot boxes, they would put patch notes like, we increase the chances of certain items appearing in the loot boxes, but not detail exact percentages. So again, regardless of whether it's a 0.01% increase or a 100% increase, it's technically true, but they can get away with essentially an update that ultimately makes no difference while pretending like they made some kind of change. They can pull what is essentially a marketing stunt more than anything that actually helps the customers and players get the experience that they want. And that's what Nintendo did here. And I don't know what they were thinking with this, because sure, temporarily, they might have gotten, that positive reception of people going, oh my God, finally Nintendo actually listened, and they quote unquote saved Mario Kart is what some of the narrative out there was, by implementing this update. But the thing is that ultimately, if the results don't reflect that kind of cheer for an update that is ultimately false, when you look at the grand scheme of things, that'll be short-lived, and the backlash will only multiply. People will feel duped by a bullet point like this, and the backlash will just be that much worse than it initially was. So Nintendo putting this Band-Aid on this gaping wound and promising to the patient that this Band-Aid is the solution to cure this gaping wound and to cure the infection surrounding it, it is certainly a choice that will ultimately come back to bite them in the ass, which it is already. I mean, Shortcat released this video just a couple hours ago, and you can see that it's getting quite a bit of viewership, and no doubt this is just the beginning of this backlash. I think Nintendo has shot itself in the foot. I think the dip in the user score will only get worse as people leave negative feedback for a game that, for them, it feels like it's been ruined by the lack of choice for players to be able to, in-game, be able to choose to only play 3-lap courses. For a lot of people, like the fact that they are railroaded into those intermission tracks, those highway tracks, it ruins the experience because they're just bored by those. They're just not engaging enough for them. So Nintendo, instead of choosing to fix the highway tracks or fix the problem of players not having choice, and instead putting out this bullet point that ultimately means absolutely nothing, that is as good as a lie, a bullet point that gives people hope before crushing them when they actually test out the feature and realize that nothing has changed and that Nintendo hyped them up for nothing, temporarily tricking people into believing that a solution has been implemented, that feedback has been listened to, will only make Nintendo's reputation tank that much further. And the fact that I'm hearing that this is actually a common thing for Nintendo's patches, like I don't cover Nintendo games as frequently, so hearing that this is a common trend for Nintendo to put out patch notes that are vague enough to be able to get, positive feedback, but then like the end result potentially not actually make enough of a difference for that bullet point to be justified, that is incredibly egregious. I'll be curious to see how much more the backlash worsens and whether Nintendo will just ultimately choose to remain stubborn. Thing is, I said in my last video that, every once in a while Nintendo chooses to forego their stubbornness and they choose to listen. It seemed as though that was not the case at all. They are remaining stubborn, only this time they are handling all of that and manipulating the narrative through deceptions in their patch notes, through obfuscations, that really are shady when you think about what they're doing here. Or at the very least, that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the current state of Mario Kart world. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.